Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Kindly support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making such audiobooks for you. The Muslim Conquest of Persia by Lieutenant General A.I. Akram. This book tells in detail about the Arab conquest of Persia, also known as the Arab conquest of Iran, during the Rashidun Caliphate from 633 to 654 AD. This conquest brought the fall of the Sassanid Empire, which was in power for over 4 centuries, while rivaling its neighbor, the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantine. Start of Chapter 4. The Battle of Buwaib. Muthanna, the bravest of the brave, bore his troubles in silence. Not a word of complaint escaped his lips, though he had much to complain about. When he had first gone to Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu to suggest an invasion of Iraq, he had hoped that he would give command of the Iran front, but Abu Bakr appointed Khalid as the commander-in-chief. Muthanna was disappointed, but accepted the Caliph's decision without resentment because of Khalid's great stature and his unique military ability. The best of generals would be happy and honored to serve under Khalid. When Khalid was sent off to Syria and Muthanna appointed commander-in-chief in Iraq, he got his just elevation and was satisfied. After the Battle of Babylon, when Muthanna went and met Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu and asked for reinforcements, he naturally expected that he would remain in command, and this was clearly Abu Bakr's intention also. But then a relatively obscure man whose qualifications for high command were doubtful was placed in command of the army in Iraq. Muthanna again felt unfairly treated, but like the good soldier and true Muslim that he was, accepted the Caliph's decision loyally and threw himself without reservation into battle under Abu Ubaid, in spite of the obviously faulty plan of the new commander. And in the disaster of the bridge, it was Muthanna who took command when all was nearly lost, and saved the Muslims from annihilation, at a personal cost of many wounds. And now that others had messed everything up and left him holding the baby, the Caliph was telling him to stay at his post. If Muthanna had belonged to the Quraysh or been a companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his fate may well have been different. But he was only from the Bani Bakr, a distant tribe. In grim silence he nursed his wounds and watched the moves of Persian forces. Far from being downhearted, he awaited his next victim, and soon fate provided him with one. As mentioned in the preceding chapter, Bahman had returned in haste after the Battle of the Bridge to deal with the uprising against Rustam. The details of this uprising are not known, but it was some sort of protest against Rustam, and some of the generals too were involved in it. One of these was Jaban, who had fought and survived in battle against Khalid and Abu Ubaid. On the return of Bahman with his victorious army, order was soon restored in Ctesiphon, and Rustam was again as firmly entrenched as ever. But Jaban was now on the run. With some followers he made his way towards Ulas for reasons not known. Muthanna came to know of his arrival in the neighborhood, and leaving Asim bin Amr in charge of the camp, set off with a few stalwarts to engage the Persians. The two parties met, and Muthanna and his men sprang at the Persians and overpowered them. Muthanna put all of them to death, including Jaban. After this little adventure, which acted as a restorative to the old campaigner, Muthanna returned to his camp at Ulais and awaited the next Persian move. The date of this event is not recorded, but would be about January 635, Zulqa'dah 13 Hijri. This was an auspicious beginning of the year 635. Things began to look up again for Muthanna. The reinforcements promised by Umar started to arrive in groups of various sizes, the largest being that of a veteran named Jarir bin Abdullah. Jarir had fought under Khalid in Iraq and marched with him to Syria. But soon after Khalid's arrival in eastern Syria, he had found it necessary to return to Arabia for certain reasons. After the Battle of the Bridge, Jarir approached Umar with his clan of Bajila and asked for marching orders. "Go and join Muthanna," said Umar. "But Syria," said Jarir. "But Iraq," replied the Caliph. Like many Arabs, Jarir and his followers were happier at the prospect of fighting in Syria, and not as keen to go and fight the Persians. Umar explained that reinforcements were urgently needed in Iraq, and that there was no need for more forces in Syria. The Muslims in Syria are on top of their enemies. Jarir remained reluctant, and finally Umar was able to persuade him to go to Iraq only by offering his clan 1/4 of the state's share of the booty. Thus the clan of Bajila would get the usual 4/5 of the booty taken by them, plus 1/4 of the remaining 1/5, which was the share of Medina. With this understanding, Jarir set off for Iraq. Before he left, the Caliph warned him, "Do not cross a river or a bridge except after victory." Several other tribal contingents also marched to Iraq. Some of these joined Muthanna at Ulais, while others joined him at Zukar, where Muthanna later moved up from Ulais. Among the better-known tribal chieftains who went to Iraq to fight in the Holy War were Jarir bin Abdullah of the Bajila, Arfaja bin Harsama of the Azd, who had been one of Abu Bakr's corps commanders in the campaign of the apostasy, and Adi bin Hatim of the Tai. The last named had fought under Khalid in the campaign of the apostasy, and was one of Khalid's prominent generals in his Iraq campaign. He was also one of the 2 tallest Arabs in history, about whom it was said that when they sat on a horse, their feet touched the ground. Reports began to trickle into Ctesiphon of the arrival of Muslim reinforcements at Ulais. These reports were followed by intelligence that Muthanna had moved up to Zukar, a few miles south of Qadisiyah, and had been joined there by more tribal groups coming up from Arabia. This information caused a considerable amount of alarm in the Persian capital. After Khalid, no Muslim was feared more by the Persians than Muthanna. He seemed indestructible. He had never lost an action, and the violence of his raids was as fearsome as their success was total. No place west of the Tigris was safe from his lightning strikes. Moreover, Muthanna appeared to be fired not only by the spirit of the Holy War, but also by an obsessive personal vendetta against the Persians. Something had to be done to prevent the Muslim horse from overrunning the Suwad again. Consequently, another Persian army was ordered out of Ctesiphon. This time a general named Mihran was placed in command of the army, which numbered 12,000 soldiers and had 3 elephants. Mihran was charged with the mission of driving the Muslims out of the region of Hira, and he marched to the Euphrates and camped by the east bank opposite the present Kufa. At about the same time, Muthanna, advancing from Zukar, where the last of the Muslim reinforcements had joined him, arrived on the west bank and camped at Nakhela, which stood roughly in the area where Kufa was later founded. Nakhela was a little away from the river. At this place, a last addition was made to Muthanna's strength in the form of two groups of Christian Arabs from the tribes of Namr and Taghlib, which inhabited western Iraq. These Christian Arabs were willing to fight along with their fellow Arabs against the Persians, and this brought Muthanna's strength up to about 8,000 men. It was now April 635, Safar 14 Hijri. By Nakhela, a small river called Buwaib took off from the Euphrates, where the southern edge of Kufa stands today, and flowed southwards, eventually joining the river Atiq, though its exact junction with the Atiq is not known. The locality at which this river began was known as Darul Rizq, and was a low-lying area which became a lake when the Euphrates rose and flooded its banks. This river was to give its name to the battle that followed. As the two armies settled down in their respective camps, Mihran sent the usual message to the Muslims: "Either you cross over to us, or we cross over to you." Muthanna was not going to commit the blunder of Abu Ubaid, and replied, "You cross." Muthanna's decision was not only a tactical imperative, but also a psychological necessity. The Muslims had taken a terrible beating at the Battle of the Bridge, and the wounds of that battle, both physical and emotional, had left deep scars. Should the Muslims suffer another defeat like the last one, it would shatter all hopes of conquest in Iraq, and not even Umar would be able to persuade the Arabian Muslims to face once again the much-feared Persian. Moreover, although Muthanna could order his men across the river, and they would obey, because the state of discipline of this army was very high, the men would keep looking over their shoulders, wondering if Mihran would do to them what Bahman had done. The location of the two camps was only a little upstream of where the Battle of the Bridge was fought, and this itself was an unpleasant reminder of that disaster. Muthanna knew that on the outcome of this battle hung the fate of Islam in Iraq, and he was determined to win it. He turned to a local Arab who stood beside him and asked, "What is the place called where Mihran is camped?" "Basusia," replied the Arab. Muthanna then remarked, "Mihran is in a bad way and shall perish, for he is camped at a place which yields nothing." In Arabic, he used a pun on the word basus, which means a she-camel which does not yield to milking. A bridge was constructed across the Euphrates, and the following morning the Persians crossed to the west bank and stopped at a place called Shumia about half a mile from the river. Here Mihran arrayed his army for battle in three groups, a center and wings, and placed an elephant in each. The commanders of his wings were Mardan Shah and the military commander of the district Hira, and Mihran placed himself in the center. He had every intention of emulating the example of Bahman. The Muslims also moved up from their camp and formed up for battle in front of the Persians. Muthanna appointed Adi bin Hatim and Jarir bin Abdullah to command the left and right wings respectively, and these were composed mainly of cavalry. The center, comprising the infantry, was placed under his brother Masud, a gallant and much admired officer, and Muthanna formed a small reserve, which was positioned behind the army and was led by another brother, Mu'anna. The army commander himself took up his station in the center, mounted on his horse Shamus, which means the refractory one, which was known for its speed and its fine gait. This horse was only mounted by Muthanna for battle. While Muthanna was arranging his lines for battle, he saw a Muslim emerge from the front rank and position himself some distance ahead of his comrades. "What is the matter with that man?" Muthanna asked. He received the reply. "He is one of those who had run away at the Battle of the Bridge, and is now determined to get killed in battle." Muthanna went to him and, nudging him gently with the handle of his lance, made him get into line with his comrades. Mihran awaited the Muslim attack, planning to hold and repulse the Muslims before launching his counterstroke. And Muthanna, wishing to seize the initiative at the very start, ordered the attack by his center and wings, leaving the reserve under his brother Mu'anna out of battle for later employment. The Muslims moved forward, and the two armies met with a clash of steel, each bent on victory or death. The Persian front remained intact and unshaken. The defenders of the empire, having tasted victory under Bahman, were determined to suffer no more defeats and fought with courage and discipline to hold their position. For some time the battle raged along the entire front. Then, as the weight of Muslim pressure slackened, the Persians began a forward movement, and the Muslims found themselves being pushed back. Clouds of dust blanketed the battlefield, and the din of battle sounded like a roar of thunder. In spite of their best efforts, the Muslims were unable to stem the tide of Persian advance. Some disorganization had now set in, as is inevitable in combat, and a few Muslim units even broke contacts and pulled back a short distance. Muthanna had his work cut out for him in restoring order and getting his troops to go once again into the attack. He galloped to every part of the front where the Persian pressure appeared to be bearing fruit, and rallied his men with the cry, to me, I am Muthanna." At times, in a fit of desperation, he would tear at his beard. Then there was a lull in the fighting, though contact remained. The Persians too needed a little rest and reorganization, and Mihran set about re-establishing order in his own formations before dealing the final blow to the Muslims. In this lull, the Muslims reformed for the attack. The commanders urged their men to fight even harder, and the men realized that on their actions depended the fate of Islam in this part of the world. Jarir, the commander of the Muslim right, addressed his own tribe. "O people of the Bajila, let none advance more speedily against this enemy than you. There is for you in this land, if you conquer it, a greater share than for other Arabs. Fight for one of the two glories." The two glories were victory and paradise. Once again the Muslims went into the attack, the center and the wings, and once again the Persians held them. The fighting increased in ferocity. Muthanna and his brother Masud, the commander of the center, struck to break the Persian center, and in this fighting Masud fell mortally wounded. Muthanna turned to his men and shouted, "O Muslims, this is the way that the best of you die. Raise your standard, may Allah raise you." Seeing that the Persians were getting tired, though not more tired than his own men, Muthanna now called up his reserve under his brother Mu'anna and threw it into the center, and these fresh troops began to play havoc with the Persian front. It was Muthanna's intention to break through the center, while his wings held the Persian wings in place. Mihran was now in a desperate position. His center was being pushed back towards the bridge. To stop the retrograde movement of his center, he went forward himself, and at the front he was killed in single combat by a Muslim warrior. According to one account, he was killed by a Christian youth from the Tajlib, according to another, by Jarir, and according to yet another, by Muthanna himself. And Allah knows best. With the death of their general, the Persian resistance weakened, the Muslim pressure against the center increased, and at last the Persian center broke. Muthanna wanted the bridge in order to prevent a Persian escape, and made a thrust towards it, but his pace was slowed by stout resistance from groups of Persian warriors who knew the vital importance of the bridge, and strove to deny it to the Muslims. The Persian wings too were now in retreat. With the death of their general, the Persian resistance weakened. The Muslim pressure against the center increased, and at last the Persian center broke. Muthanna wanted the bridge in order to prevent a Persian escape, and made a thrust towards it. But his pace was slowed by stout resistance from groups of Persian warriors who knew the vital importance of the bridge and strove to deny it to the Muslims. The Persian wings too were now in retreat. At last Muthanna broke through and captured the bridge and stopped all movement over it. Some part of the Persian army had already managed to cross to safety, but the bulk of it was cut off west of the river, and here the Muslims inflicted the most fearful casualties upon their foes. The Persians scattered and fled north and south, but were pursued by the Muslim cavalry till nightfall and again the next day. A large number of the fugitives were killed in the pursuit. Those who escaped the slaughter made their way to Ctesiphon to tell a tale of woe which Ctesiphon had heard many times before. The Battle of Buwaib was Muthanna's revenge for the disaster of the bridge. The debt had been cleared. For many years the plain on which this battle was fought was littered with the whitened bones of the Persian fallen, and it was not till 2 decades later that these bones were covered with sand. This battle also became known as the Battle of Tens, because 100 Muslims killed 10 Persians each in combat. By the evening of the day of battle, all the forward supplies of the Persians had fallen into Muslim hands, consisting mainly of sheep and cattle, and Muthanna decided to drive the herds to the Muslim camp, where the women and children awaited news of the battle. The herds were put in charge of a Christian Arab prince named Abdul Masih bin Amr bin Bukayla, with instructions to convey them to the camp. As Abdul Masih neared the Muslim camp, the women, seeing him and seeing some other horsemen with him, feared that this was a Persian raiding party which had got to their camp. The women armed themselves with stones and tent poles and formed a line in front of the children. They were going to fight and die rather than be captured by an unbelieving enemy. The misunderstanding was soon cleared up, of course, but the Arab prince was amazed at the sight of the Muslim women preparing to fight. He remarked, "Even thus should be the women of this army." Muthanna, who had an unerring and intuitive sense of timing, now threw his army across the Euphrates, and the Arab horse again galloped over the fertile plain of the Suwad. Asim was sent to raid Sabat, a few miles west of Ctesiphon, Jarir to the Tigris down to Kaskar, and Muthanna himself led a large column to Anbar, then to Baghdad, and then to Tikrit. So much booty was gathered by the Muslims that its transportation became a serious problem, and Muthanna had to order that only gold and silver would be taken in the raids. The Suwad once again became the property of Islam. The Persian army once again stood behind the Tigris, and Muthanna was once again in his element, master of every inch of land where his horse placed its hoof. This was not the defeat of one race by another. It was the victory of Islam over an unbelieving empire. The part that the spirit of Islam playing in this campaign is evident from the words of Muthanna, uttered after the Battle of Buwaib. I have fought Arabs and Persians, fought them in the time of ignorance and in Islam. By Allah, during the ignorance 100 Persians were stronger than 1,000 Arabs. But today 100 Arabs are stronger than 1,000 Persians. The southern part of Iraq was suffering from neglect. After his conquest of Uballa, as Khalid advanced to Hira, the strategic center of gravity and the focus of attention shifted northwestwards to the Euphrates and the central Suwad. Uballa was reoccupied by the Persians, who placed a garrison there, and none remained to show the Muslim flag but Qutbah bin Qatada, with a few hundred followers. Qutbah carried out desultory raiding, but this theatre was very much in the shadow. The theatre was nevertheless, from a long-term point of view, of considerable importance. Much of the Persian resources in men and material needed to sustain the war came from the province of Fars and passed through the junction of Ahwaz, and all seaborne supplies were landed at Uballa. If these lines of supply could be severed or at least disrupted, the effect on the Persian war machine would be a serious one. Umar decided to do something about it, but unfortunately underestimated the magnitude of the task. Having dispatched Abu Ubaid to the main front in Iraq, he sent Sharih bin Amr with a few hundred men as a reinforcement to Qutbah and instructed him to raid deeper into Persia. Qutbah sent Sharih across the Tigris to carry out the Caliph's orders by raiding Ahwaz. Sharih advanced upon Ahwaz, but at a place called Taris on the way he was intercepted and killed by a Persian garrison. Qutbah resumed his role of observation and pinpricks. Then took place the Battle of Buwaib and the reoccupation of the central Suwad by Muthanna. On getting news of this victory, Qutbah wrote to Umar and asked for large-scale reinforcements so that he could take a more active part in the war against the Persians. Umar was already contemplating a serious effort on this sector and sent for Utbah bin Ghazwan, an immigrant and one of the early companions. Allah, Most High and Mighty, began the Caliph, has given Hira and what is around it to your brothers, whose cavalry has subdued the region of Babylon, and he has killed a great one of their nobles. The reference was to the Persian Mihran who had fallen at Buwaib. I am concerned that their Persian brothers will attempt to help them. I wish to send you to Uballa to prevent people on one side from helping their brothers on the other. Go to the region of Uballa and keep the people of Ahwaz and Fars and Maysan occupied so that they do not help their comrades in the Suwad against your brothers who are there. And keep your forces concentrated at one place. Fight them in the hope that Allah will give you victory. March with faith in Allah and fear Allah. Be fair in judgment. Say your prayers at the appointed times and remember Allah much. Utbah bin Ghazwan set off from Medina with 2,000 men and arrived in the region of Uballa, where he took Qutbah under command. His arrival took place in June 635, Rabiul Akhir, 14 Hijri, and he remained here for 2 months, awaiting further reinforcements which Umar was dispatching in groups. There were 4 Persian districts over which the Muslims would operate, and these briefly were as follows. A. Furat, district on the east bank of the Tigris opposite and below Uballa. B. Abarqabaz, district on the east bank of the Tigris opposite and below Mazar, in other words, north of Furat. C. Dast Maisan, district east of Abarqabaz up to Ahwaz. And D. Maysar, district west of the Tigris at Mazar and below. If these four districts could be occupied by the Muslims, Persian supplies coming from Fars would be severely affected and would have to use a wide detour from the north. The Muslims were encamped by the side of Basra, the old Basra that is, which is more or less the present Zubair, 12 miles from modern Basra. But there was no Basra then, for the town had not yet been built. What existed at this place was the ruins of an ancient town, and beside and among these ruins, the Muslims had established their camp. Near these ruins was fought the first action in this mini-campaign. The governor of the district of Furat had been receiving reports of the increase in Muslim strength in the bordering desert across from Uballa, and could guess that once Muslim strength had been sufficiently built up, their action would be far from passive. This was also obvious from the offensive posture of the Muslims elsewhere in Iraq. He therefore planned to put in a preemptive strike and eliminate the Muslim threat on his front. With this aim in view, he gathered all his troops, which included the garrisons of Uballa, and with 4,000 men marched towards the ruins. He hoped to catch the Muslims unaware in their tents and gave to his men ropes to tie around the necks of the Arabs and bring them in like cattle. On arrival near the ruins, however, he found an army about as strong as his own awaiting him. In the battle that followed, a large number of Persians were killed and the governor was taken captive, while the rest fled to Uballa. The Arab of the desert was a master in exploiting a success and pursuing a defeated foe, and the very next day the Muslims appeared at the gates of Uballa. The Persians, defeated the day before in battle, offered no resistance, and Uballa fell to the Muslims for the second time since the beginning of the Muslim invasion of Iraq. This happened in Rajab 14 Hijri, August or September of 635. Utbah bin Ghazwan lost no time in crossing the Tigris. The district of Furat had little opposition to offer, and a few Muslim mounted groups went through it to make sure that no hostile soldiers remained. Then Utbah marched into the district of Dast Maisan without, however, going as far as Ahwaz. In this district a small Persian force prepared for battle, but it was easily defeated, and having established Muslim authority here, Utbah marched westwards into the district of Abarqabaz, which also bowed before the Muslims. The districts east of the Tigris were now in Muslim hands. Utbah returned to Uballa and sent a force under one of his officers across the Euphrates. This force captured Mazar and subdued the district of Maysan before joining Utbah at Uballa. It had hardly returned, however, when news was received that Abarqabaz had revolted. The governor of Abarqabaz was a Persian named Filhan, who had accepted Muslim rule as a matter of necessity until he was strong enough to throw off the yoke. Hence he had signed a treaty with Utbah acknowledging the Muslims, but now he gathered a small force and prepared for battle. Utbah sent Mughira bin Shuba with the bulk of his small army to Abarqabaz to deal with the revolt. Mughira marched to Maghrib, where Filhan awaited him, and at Maghrib the Persians were again defeated and their commander killed. Having reimposed Muslim rule over Abar Qabas, Mughira returned to Uballa. Hardly had he got back when Maysan, the district west of the Tigris, also revolted, and pursuing the mission given him by his commander, Mughira crossed the Euphrates and crushed this revolt also. This was the last attempt by the Persians to dispute Muslim rule in these districts. By about Ramadan, 14 Hijri, October or November 635, these 4 districts were in Muslim hands and remained so for some time. This had a restricting effect on the movement of Persian supplies through Ahwaz, but it would be incorrect to say that the route of supply to Ctesiphon was severed. The Muslim strength here was not enough to achieve this end, and they contented themselves with the moderate success which they had gained. Soon after these actions, Utbah left Uballa to visit Medina, but died while he was on his way back, and Umar appointed Mughira bin Shoba as the commander of this front. Mughira was a sturdy soldier and a gifted man, whom the reader will come to know better in the chapters that follow. End of chapter 4.